Welcome to the IR Digital Podcast, a part of IR Global, the largest international professional services network. I'm your host of the IR Digital Podcast, Jennifer Riggins. Today we are sitting down with Paul Beare, CEO and founder of Paul Beare Limited, a group of 33 UK-based accountants and legal advisors working with overseas companies coming to the UK. And don't worry for our North American listeners, I'm clearly an American living in London, so I can help out with any British American translation that may be needed, and I'll call Paul on his Britishisms if it's not clear, so we speak a common language that we often don't. So today we're talking about all you need to know to take your brand to the UK. Before we begin, Paul, can you please introduce yourself? Welcome, by the way.
Hello, I'm Paul Beare, and I look after Paul Beare Limited. We've been going now since probably about 8 years or so now under my own brand, and over that period we've certainly grown from strength to strength and probably helped some nearly 400 companies set up in the UK.
Oh, wow. That's fantastic. Okay. And then who would benefit from listening to this conversation? Who should stay on?
Those companies that are looking at setting up in the UK in the not too distant future, we often get companies that approach us that are looking at setting up over a 6 to 12 month period, but likewise in the upcoming period, but likewise those companies that are just setting up in the UK, they may have just taken on their first employee or a contractor and they're looking to test the market, for example, or those companies that are actively going and are knee-deep into the British business scene and need some support and advice along the way.
Okay, great. And I assume that everything we're going to talk about your company or your associates offer unless we otherwise state. So we understand that what you're providing advice, but also these are services you can offer, though you're offering the advice for free now. Just to clarify, and you'll clarify if anything is out of your realm or maybe something you don't recommend people do, things like that.
I would agree with that, yes. This is a general overview about doing business in the UK, and the topics that we've selected to discuss, they are certainly areas that me and my team can assist with.
Okay, great. I just wanted to clarify. So let's provide that advice on international expansion to the UK. There must be different ways to go about it. The way to start would be, what are the various levels of British market entry?
A client will often come to us when they've got a need or a problem, or they're looking at testing the UK market to see whether their product, service or offering is right for them. So what I mean by that is a company will say to us, we think there's a market presence in the UK. What do we need to do to set up a company? Is it difficult to open a bank account? We've heard it can be. What do we need to do to employ our first hire in the UK? There's different touch points for expansion, but one of the key differentiators is often revenue, understandably, for a company. So typically we'll have a client that will approach us and say, look, we want to hire this person in the UK, but we don't want to set up any sort of legal entity. Is that possible? And it is possible to have a payroll scheme, PAYE scheme, pay as you earn, and that scheme can be registered in the name of the parent entity. And when I talk about parent entity, I mean in that home jurisdiction, such as the US, Canada, New Zealand, Germany, for example, as opposed to registering a UK entity that's owned by a parent entity.
And how is that different from an employer of record or another tool?
Good question. Typically, the employer of record is the owner of the employee. The employee, albeit with different legal agreements, is controlled by that operating client. But in this situation, it is a UK payroll scheme registered with HMRC, IRD equivalent, or the Inland Revenue, Her Majesty's Revenue and Customs, and that payroll scheme is in the entity name of the direct employer as opposed to a third party.
Okay. And are there benefits for doing one or the other, or when you're testing out that market?
Typically, cost comes down to it. On the face of it, if you're employing a lower level employee on a lower salary, then the cost through an employer of record is often substantially low. But if you're looking at a country manager who's on perhaps circa 100,000 GBP, then the percentage to employ them through an employer of record is a lot higher through that. Whereas the payroll scheme registered in the name of the client is often far cheaper.
Okay, that makes sense. Yeah, so just sensible of what works for you in the moment.
Exactly.
And
what works in the moment isn't necessarily what's right in 6 months' time. So we'll often have someone, a client or the employees that say to us in 12 months' time, thank you, I've been on a payroll scheme, now we're ready to set up an entity in the UK.
Okay, that makes sense. Yeah, you're testing out the market. If you are maybe hiring one specific developer in another country, it may make sense, but then you need to figure out when you want to go through the rigmarole of setting up an entity or a business. It's different. So speaking of that rigmarole, what are the types of entities or businesses that you can set up here being the UK where I'm based?
There are two main types of entities that can be offered here. One is a branch, and our American clients often refer to a branch office being set up in the UK, and a branch office, terminology-wise, could be very different to the registration of a branch. A branch is an overseas company that's registered with Companies House. It is governed by the parent company legal jurisdiction. It is registered at Companies House, but it is not governed by English law, as opposed to a limited company, which would typically be a subsidiary. Quite often it would be a wholly owned subsidiary with a typical share capital of £1 or £100. And the subsidiary there is still registered at Companies House. It still must file English UK year-end accounts and prepare and submit its confirmation statement. Its confirmation statement is the annual snapshot into the shareholders and directors/officers of that company.
Is there a reason you'd want to do one or the other?
The branch is typically longer to register. It requires a paper-based form to go to the registrar of companies at Companies House. Typically that takes around 3 to 4 weeks to register. The subsidiary, provided that you have all of the information, that can be registered overnight with Companies House. And for a nominal fee, it can also be registered same day.
Oh, wow. Okay. So it's about how fast you want to move is one of the main reasons.
Yes. However, to close down the branch is a lot quicker as a process. To close down the subsidiary takes between 3 to 4 months.
Okay, fair enough. So you have to figure out what works for you and how secure you are that you want to continue business here.
And typically a branch, when it's registered, is the route for a branch registration is often to test that marketplace, that market validity. Is the UK the right place for us as a company to do business? Is it where we want to go? Do we have those customers ready to go?
Mm-hmm. Fair enough, yeah. So I've been through this mess. How do you go about setting up a bank account, especially maybe if you're not on site here?
Okay, this is a very big topic, so I'll provide a succinct overview on the different types that are available. When I talk about a fintech account, I mean one of those challenger fintech providers where you can open an account within 2 weeks or so. When I talk about a high street account, that's a typical checking account or a retail bank. Some of those brands, NatWest, HSBC, Barclays, they fall under the high street account.
Okay.
In order to get a fintech account, we still need to complete the anti-money laundering and know your client checks that we're obligated to undertake as professional advisors. Typically, that is the detail on the shareholders, the directors, the officers of the parent company and the UK entity. What do the transactions look like? Who is a typical customer? What's their typical spend? That sort of information. And as I mentioned, that can be operational within about 2 weeks. For a high street bank account with those brands I've suggested, there's some different criteria around that. Typically, it's 3 to 6 months to have that account operational. Typically, you'll also need a UK-based resident director of the company. You do not need to have the UK-based resident director to have a company, the subsidiary, registered at Companies House. And I know for our Australia and New Zealand-based clients, you do need an in-country director. You do not need that for the UK. But the problems that arise in going through that high street bank account application all stem around the anti-money laundering and know your client checks. It's just a long, drawn-out process. We handhold our clients as we go through that process. We take the strain away from our clients as we're guiding them through it, and we complete all of the form filling for both fintech and high street bank account options.
Okay, so it just comes down to preference in sense of time, basically.
Time and brand. Some clients prefer the credibility and panache that a brand like that carries. Some of those banking institutions have been around for certainly longer than I have. Some of those fintech providers are very new to the market. And while they are very new, it all depends on what's right for each client at the time. If they have a customer that needs to pay their invoice, for example, or they have employees and they need to pay them their salaries, and of course that can certainly steer them down the fintech route. It's not uncommon for us to see clients that opt for the fintech solution in the first instance while we go through the process of the high street bank account application.
Oh, that definitely makes sense. You can get the best of both there. And yeah, because I don't think Starling or Monzo or other local fintechs may not be known internationally, and that may be something that in the long term is a problem, but in the short term you want your employees to get paid. That's very sensible.
Well, this is something that we come back to later as well, about talking to your trusted partners, those that have been there and done that. And actually you need to talk to them at the beginning and listen, because there are pros and cons of both options. And actually, yes, it's okay to start the process for a high street account, but you need to go into it with your eyes open. It's a 3 to 6 month process. In one extreme case, a client took 9 months to go through that process. If there's trusts of ownership, unit or discretionary trusts at the top of the ultimate beneficial owner structure, that can cause complications and further delays. We're used to seeing those trusts of ownership from certain countries where they're popular. For example, out of the US, trusts aren't that common.
Absolutely. So speaking of the US, a percentage of our listeners are probably used to this at will employment, and that's just not how it works in Europe or most countries, I think. Let's talk about HR compliance, payroll, immigration, and anything in that bucket of hiring staff in your new entity in England or UK.
Okay, so typically you may have made a job offer to your incoming hire or your employee. That's fine. Typically that's a skeleton offer. It sets out the particulars of the terms. It will contain things such as the salary, any benefits, that sort of thing. But what you must do from day one of the employee being on board is you must offer them a contract of employment. Actually, it's best practice to provide this before they start employment, and they will want that. Typically, if they're handing in their notice or they've got to work through a notice period with their current employer or former employer at that point, they will want to see the particulars in there. And typically, payroll in the UK is monthly. We don't offer bi-monthly payroll in the UK. It is available, but for a salaried individual, payroll is run monthly. Typically, it's in the middle or on the last working day of the month.
Okay, fair enough. Now, what if you want to take an employee from your home country and have them set up the office here? How do you go about the immigration of it?
You can do that, absolutely. You need to have a sponsor license in place from the Home Office. To go through that process can take around 8 to 10 weeks. There are other functions of the business that you must have in place as well as part of that application. That could be employers and public liability insurance policy, both of which are mandatory for employing individuals in the UK. And you can typically get a combined policy for less than £1,000 per year for, say, a 2-person operation. You must also have your PAYE scheme in place as well. And you must have other functions such as VAT and a bank account as well.
Mm-hmm. And in the meantime, if that's like 10 weeks, that's still in the realm where they could be on a tourist visa, but technically working from the U.S. or from their home country. And so you could do the process and they can start setting up shop here as more of a tourist. Or is that legal or no?
Generally, that's okay. Typically, the employee has to be in their home jurisdiction for us to go through that process of applying their certificate of sponsorship. So it's a 3-part process. There's the sponsorship license for the company. And at the time of the sponsor license being submitted, we ask for an allocation of certificates. These are called certificates of sponsorship. Once the certificates of sponsorship have been issued to the company as part of the sponsor license, then we assign those certificates of sponsorship to the employee, and the employee then completes that application process for their criteria to come and live and work in the UK.
Okay. And of course, we all know that we've adapted that you can do a lot of work as well. So there are ways to keep growing while you're going through the bureaucracy, though having a partner to help you through it sounds valuable. And
precisely.
Then,
and there are certain criteria where it is possible for the individuals to come to the UK on short-term work visas while a sponsor license application is underway. That criteria is very strict and specific, as you can appreciate, but in a further conversation in more detail, then we can advise the clients where that is available to them.
Absolutely, yeah. And speaking of all this, I don't think we've really touched on pensions, which would be quite a different thing here than other countries, I think. Explain that.
Pensions in the UK is a legal requirement. We call it auto-enrolment. Initially, it is the company's choice as to whether they automatically enrol the employees in the first pay run. Likewise, the company can defer by 3 months to auto-enroll the employees. That is the employer's prerogative. It is also the employer's prerogative to choose which type of pension scheme and the contribution basis that the employees will be enrolled in. For example, you can have a government-backed scheme such as Nest or the People's Pension, or you can go for an enhanced provider with one of the bigger brands, whether that's Scottish Widows or Aegon, for example. The employees will be automatically enrolled into that pension scheme, but they can opt out. Typically, you could have an individual that will have a personal pension, and the employee could say, I'm not interested in joining the company scheme, but I'd like the company, as my employer, to contribute to my personal scheme. Typically, most companies will allow this and offer it.
Okay, wow. And that is why you need a partner to translate things like Scottish Widows, which just is a horrible name. Very dramatic old name here. This is why you need someone that's in the know. And
there are certain things that are quite draconian about the UK. Some of our American clients may get frustrated that we ask for a passport as part of our anti-money laundering and know your client checks as part of a proof of identity. And of course, that's typically a hurdle when certain individuals don't have a passport at all.
Which is shocking unto itself and is a hurdle of 4 to 6 months minimum in the U.S. But if you're here 3 weeks, regular passport update, so these are hurdles we all have to bear and be prepared for getting ahead of. And I think on this area of hiring people, I think there's other corporate services and annual compliance aspects. Maybe you want to give an overview of that. I'm not sure what that is either.
As part of being a director of a company, you need to ensure that certain aspects, obligations are fulfilled, whether that's completing the confirmation statement that I mentioned earlier, ensuring that the statutory books are maintained and held at the registered office of the company. That can be digitally, of course, as well. Corporate services can also include change of registered office, director appointments and resignations, and the associated resolutions and forms that go off to Companies House, and the resolutions that will sit with the statutory books, and share classifications throughout that period, any official changes that must be made. And we offer that service to our clients as well.
And when you say house, what do you mean? You've used that word quite a bit. The
Companies House.
Is that headquarters?
Companies House is the governing body for all of those entities that are registered in the UK.
Okay, yeah. I think that was one to clarify, but maybe that's just me. So thank you for that. So I guess the less exciting for some people, but very exciting for you topic to talk about, we still haven't yet, is accounting and bookkeeping, taxation. How does all that work?
Typically, a client will come to us and say that their transactions are low and that they wish to maintain the accounting and bookkeeping in-house, which is absolutely fine. What we'll often suggest for a company that is VAT registered, that's value-added tax, and the standard rate here is 20%, and returns typically are quarterly. And you can reclaim your input tax here, and you must pay over if you're charging VAT to your clients. Typically here, we'll suggest that we review the VAT return on a quarterly basis to ensure that the appropriate rate of VAT has been used and collected where possible on certain expenditure, whether that's subsistence or hotel accommodation or travelling through Europe, that sort of thing. And at that point, we'll either submit the return on behalf of our clients, or our clients will through Xero, for example, the cloud-based accounting platform, or other such provider. The annual accounts are due annually, as we say, and the period of that initial return often depends on when the company is registered. So you'll either get an extended or shortened period of time, depending on when the company is registered. But again, we go through that process with our clients and advise them accordingly.
Okay, as we wind down, Paul, are there any other services that you offer that our listeners should be aware of that maybe help them in coming to the UK?
Yes, as part of our corporate services offering, we're typically appointed as company secretary to our clients, and our address is also the registered office with Companies House. That is the location where all the official documentation, such as payroll registration or VAT registration certificates, are received. And in our capacity as company secretary, we're ensuring that any of those notices or documentation are received and handled promptly and efficiently.
Okay. So we've covered a lot about the UK, but often when companies from Australasia or the Americas are coming to Europe, they often start in London or start in the UK because linguistically it's easier, other reasons, it's a big market, and then they want to launch to other jurisdictions across Europe, for example. Do you help out with that? How does that work?
It's very typical for a client to approach us and say, thank you for your services. We want to expand into other jurisdiction. That could be France, Germany, the US, for example, or anywhere in the world. Do you have a counterpart firm that you can refer us to that will support us like you? And our membership of IR Global allows us to do just that. I've been a member for just over 10 years, met some wonderful people through the organisation. I actively sit on the Corporate Services Practice Area Committee for those member firms that are helping with corporate services matters. And I also sit on the Ethics Committee within IR Global as well. So at that point, when a client says, we're trying to do this in the Netherlands, for example, I can pick up the phone to a firm that I've met a number of times and happily call a friend and introduce them to that client, and I know that they'll be looked after by that provider.
Okay. Wouldn't it be easier to outsource a lot of this or not set it up yourself? Because it sounds like a distraction from the value you're trying to add by expanding here? I guess you want to focus on sales or support, things like that.
Precisely. And this comes back to that old adage of we don't know what we don't know. So some of our clients will say to us, we're on a different time zone, completely different continent. We don't want to be hands-on with any of these aspects. We want you to take care and handle the payroll, the accounting, the bookkeeping, and the annual compliance as well.
Okay. And also, and I have been hosting this podcast for several years, and I didn't realize, but IR Global and its members benefit a foundation called the Sinchi Foundation, which helps people that are indigenous in areas of great threat, the Amazon, the global lungs, things like that, help them protect the earth. So there is a benefit to that, and you can listen to my conversation with the founder, Thomas Wheeler, wherever you find podcasts. So thank you very much, Paul. Before we go, if our listeners want to touch base with you to learn more about you, your services, and they likely have more questions because every case is a little more specific and different, how do they go about getting in touch with you?
You'll find my contact details attached to this podcast underneath. You can also get in touch by emailing me directly, Paul, P-A-U-L, at paulbeare, paulbeare.com. Likewise, paulbeare.com is the website, and you'll find lots of further walkthroughs and guides there about doing business in the UK, complete with case studies from other clients that have been there and done that.
Okay, thank you so much, Paul, and thank you, listeners. These IR Digital podcasts are meant to be educational resources from experienced lawyers, accountants, and financial advisors. These trusted advisors with extensive knowledge on topics U.S. professionals need to know more about. To learn more about IR Digital and its services, please visit irglobal.com. And if you found this episode useful, please consider sharing it. Thank you all so much.